They say there are some stories that shouldn't be told, some names that shouldn't be spoken, and some minds that shouldn't be understood. But understanding evil isn't about glorifying it. It's about recognizing it before it's too late. And there's no name in the annals of American crime that carries more weight, more terror, more fascination than Theodore Robert Bundy. This is the story of a man who didn't look like a monster. He looked like your neighbor, your classmate, your friend. He had charm, intelligence, and a smile that could disarm anyone. But behind that carefully constructed facade was something far darker, something that would claim the lives of at least 30 young women and girls across multiple states. This is the story of how a child born into deception became one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. November 24th, 1946, Burlington, Vermont. Inside the Elizabeth Lund home for unwed mothers, a 22-year-old woman named Eleanor Louise Cowell gave birth to a son. The birth certificate listed the father as unknown, though rumors would swirl for decades about his true identity. Some claimed it was Lloyd Marshall, an Air Force veteran. Others whispered about a man named Jack Worthington, who had abandoned Louise when she became pregnant. The darkest rumors suggested something even more sinister, something that would remain buried in family secrets. But what happened next would shape everything that followed. Louise's deeply religious parents were humiliated by their daughter's illegitimate child, so they made a decision that would echo through the decades. They decided to raise the boy as their own son, telling him that his mother was actually his older sister. For the first years of his life, Theodore Robert Cowell believed his grandparents were his parents. He had no idea that the woman he called sister was actually the woman who had given him life. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a foundation built on lies, and it would crack under the weight of truth in ways no one could have predicted. The boy who would become Ted Bundy was raised in a world where nothing was as it seemed, where the most basic truths about his existence were fabricated, where trust was something that could be shattered without warning. Even as a toddler, something was wrong. Louise's youngest sister, Julia, would later recall a memory that haunted her for decades. She had been napping in her bed when she slowly awakened to find herself surrounded by kitchen knives, carefully arranged in a circle around her sleeping form. Standing beside the bed, smiling down at her, was 3-year-old Ted. He had methodically collected every sharp blade in the house and positioned them around his sleeping aunt, like some twisted ritual. When she asked him what he was doing, he just smiled wider. This wasn't the only disturbing incident. Neighbors in Tacoma, Washington, where the family eventually moved, remembered Ted as a mean-spirited kid who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain. One neighbor, Sandy Holt, claimed she witnessed Ted hanging a stray cat from a clothesline and setting it on fire with lighter fluid. She described how he would lure younger children into the woods, force them to strip naked, and terrorize them until their screams could be heard for blocks. These weren't the actions of a troubled child acting out. They were calculated, deliberate, and performed with an unsettling sense of satisfaction. Ted would spend hours in the woods, methodically pulling apart mice, studying their anatomy as they died. He would try to drown other children while swimming, disguising his attempts as playful roughhousing. He stole constantly, not because he needed anything, but because taking what belonged to others gave him a sense of power. When Ted was 4 years old, his mother took him to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a military cook. Ted was formally adopted and took the Bundy name, but this new family structure only added another layer of confusion to his already fractured sense of identity. Johnny tried to be a father to Ted, but the boy remained distant, withdrawn, and increasingly disturbed. As Ted grew older, his behavior became more sophisticated, but no less troubling. He developed an obsession with peering through windows, watching people in their most private moments. He would spend hours studying people, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities. He wasn't just a voyeur, he was a predator in training, though no one recognized the signs. The revelation that would shatter what remained of Ted's connection to reality came during his teenage years. His cousin John, who had always been competitive with Ted, decided to share a devastating piece of information. John had discovered Ted's original birth certificate, and with it, the truth about his parentage. In a moment of cruel triumph, John showed Ted the document that proved his entire life had been built on a lie. Ted had always been told he was legitimate, that his parents were his grandparents, that his sister was actually his mother. Now, faced with the official documentation of his illegitimate birth, something inside him snapped. The discovery didn't just hurt him, it humiliated him. It confirmed what he had always suspected, but never wanted to believe. That he was different, that he was unwanted, that he was a mistake that had to be hidden away. This revelation coincided with Ted's increasing awareness of social class and status. He became obsessed with wealth, with respectability, with the kind of life that seemed forever out of reach for someone like him. He looked at his great aunt and uncle as role models, but even they seemed impossibly distant from his reality. He told people his childhood dream had been to be adopted by Roy Rogers, the famous cowboy actor. "My life was boring," he would later say, "and the life of Roy Rogers was exciting." But Ted was determined to create his own excitement, his own version of success. He graduated from Woodrow Wilson High School in 1965 and enrolled at the University of Puget Sound, only to transfer to the University of Washington after a year. He changed his major from Chinese to psychology, dropped out, enrolled at Temple University in Philadelphia for a single semester, then returned to the University of Washington once again. This pattern of starting and stopping, of never quite committing to anything, would define much of Ted's early adult life. He was searching for something, but he didn't know what. He was trying to become someone, but he didn't know who. And then he met Diane Edwards, and everything changed. Diane was everything Ted thought he wanted. Wealthy, beautiful, sophisticated, connected. She had long, dark hair parted in the middle, an upper-class background, and the kind of social status that Ted desperately craved. He fell for her completely, obsessively, and for a while, it seemed like she might be the key to the life he had always dreamed of. But Diane saw through Ted's carefully constructed facade. She recognized his lack of direction, his absence of real ambition, his desperate need for validation. When she broke up with him, citing his immaturity and lack of prospects, Ted was devastated. This wasn't just romantic rejection, it was a repudiation of everything he thought he could become. The breakup with Diane became a turning point in Ted's psychological development. He became determined to win her back, but not through genuine change or growth. Instead, he decided to transform himself into the kind of man he thought she wanted: successful, charming, accomplished. He enrolled in law school, became involved in politics, and even volunteered at a crisis hotline where he demonstrated an unsettling ability to empathize with people in distress while hiding his own increasingly sinister thoughts. This period of Ted's life was marked by a growing sophistication in his ability to manipulate his public image. He learned to present himself as caring, responsible, and trustworthy. He developed the skills that would later make him such an effective predator: the ability to read people, to understand their vulnerabilities, to present himself as exactly what they needed him to be. But beneath this carefully crafted exterior, something darker was growing. Ted's fantasies were becoming more violent, more detailed, more focused on control and domination. He was developing what would become his signature approach: the use of charm and deception to lure victims into situations where he could exercise complete power over them. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. The troubled child who had arranged knives around his sleeping aunt was becoming a young man who spent his days helping people in crisis and his nights fantasizing about inflicting pain and terror. The boy who had tortured animals in the woods was becoming someone who saw human beings as objects to be manipulated and controlled. And through it all, Ted maintained his facade of normalcy. He went to classes, worked at respectable jobs, maintained relationships with friends and family. No one suspected that behind his charming smile and helpful demeanor was a mind that was slowly, methodically planning something unspeakable. The stage was set for what would become one of the most horrific crime sprees in American history. Ted Bundy had all the tools he needed: intelligence, charm, good looks, and a complete lack of empathy for his fellow human beings. He had learned to blend into society while harboring fantasies that would have horrified anyone who knew him. The only question was when he would act on those fantasies. The answer would come in 1974, when Ted Bundy would begin a killing spree that would terrorize multiple states and claim the lives of dozens of young women. But that transformation from fantasy to reality, from disturbed young man to active serial killer, was still in the future. For now, Ted Bundy was still learning, still practicing, still perfecting the skills that would make him one of the most effective predators in criminal history. He was becoming a master of deception, a student of human psychology, and a walking embodiment of the terrifying truth that evil often wears the most innocent face. The boy who had been born into deception was about to become a man who would use deception as a weapon, and the world would never be the same. By the winter of 1974, Ted Bundy had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The disturbed young man who had spent years perfecting his facade of normalcy was about to unleash a reign of terror that would span multiple states and claim dozens of lives. What began as dark fantasies in his troubled mind was about to become a horrifying reality that would change the landscape of criminal investigation forever. The transition from fantasy to action didn't happen overnight. Bundy had been building toward this moment for years, honing his ability to manipulate and deceive. His experiences at the University of Washington had taught him how to blend in, how to appear trustworthy, how to exploit the basic human instinct to help others in need. These skills would become the foundation of his killing methodology. January 1974 marked the beginning of what investigators would later call the most prolific serial killing spree in American history. His first known attack occurred on January 4th when he broke into the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks, a University of Washington student. In the dead of night, he entered her room and brutally beat her with a metal rod torn from her bed frame. The attack was savage, calculated, and nearly fatal. Sparks was found the next morning in a pool of blood, her skull fractured, barely clinging to life. The attack on Karen Sparks was a test run, a way for Bundy to gauge his own capacity for violence and his ability to evade capture. Sparks survived, though she would suffer permanent disabilities from the assault. Her survival was perhaps the only mercy in what would become an increasingly brutal pattern of violence. For Bundy, the attack confirmed what he had long suspected about himself, that he was capable of crossing the ultimate line. But surviving victims left witnesses, and Bundy learned from this mistake. His next attack would be different, more thorough, more complete. On February 1st, 1974, he entered the basement room of 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy, another University of Washington student. This time, he came prepared with a more sophisticated plan. He bludgeoned her unconscious, then methodically dressed her in jeans and a shirt, wrapped her in a bedsheet, and carried her out into the night. The discovery of Healy's disappearance sent shockwaves through the University of Washington campus. Her roommates found her bed neatly made, her nightgown hanging in the closet, and a small bloodstain on her pillow, the only evidence of the violence that had occurred. The precision of the crime was chilling. Bundy had managed to abduct a young woman from her own bedroom without alerting anyone in the house. It was a level of planning and execution that suggested this wasn't the work of an opportunistic criminal, but someone far more dangerous. The investigation into Healy's disappearance revealed disturbing details about Bundy's methodology. He had clearly surveilled the house, learning the routines of the residents, identifying the best point of entry, and planning his escape route. The fact that he had taken the time to dress his victim suggested a level of control and organization that was deeply unsettling to investigators. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was a carefully orchestrated abduction. As winter turned to spring, more young women began disappearing from the Seattle area. Donna Gail Manson vanished on March 12th while walking to a jazz concert at Evergreen State College. The 19-year-old was last seen leaving her dormitory, her flute case in hand, heading toward what she thought would be an evening of music. She never arrived at the concert, and despite extensive searches, no trace of her was ever found. The pattern was becoming clear to investigators, though they didn't yet understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. Young women, typically college students, were disappearing without a trace. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no evidence left behind. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The only common thread was their demographic profile, attractive young women with long, dark hair parted in the middle. Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared on April 17th from the campus of Central Washington University. The 18-year-old was last seen leaving her dormitory to attend a meeting about a German film. Like the others, she simply vanished, leaving behind no clues about what had happened to her. Her disappearance followed the same pattern as the others, a young woman going about her normal routine, then suddenly gone. By now, panic was beginning to spread through college campuses across Washington state. Young women were warned not to walk alone at night, Dormitory security was increased, and students began traveling in groups. But Bundy's ability to strike in broad daylight, to appear trustworthy and non-threatening, meant that even these precautions weren't enough to stop him. Roberta Kathleen Parks vanished on May 6th from Oregon State University, expanding Bundy's hunting ground beyond Washington. The 22-year-old was last seen in the Student Union building, but like the others, she disappeared without a trace. Her disappearance confirmed investigators' worst fears, that they were dealing with a killer who was mobile, organized, and showing no signs of stopping. The breakthrough that investigators desperately needed came on July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park. On what should have been a peaceful summer day, with families enjoying picnics and water activities, Bundy committed one of his most brazen acts. In broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses, he approached young women with a story about needing help loading a sailboat onto his car. The first victim was 23-year-old Janice Ott, who was sunbathing alone when a handsome young man with his arm in a sling approached her. Witnesses later reported hearing him introduce himself as Ted and ask for help with his boat, so Ott, trusting and helpful, agreed to assist him. She was never seen alive again. Later that same day, Bundy returned to the park and approached 19-year-old Denise Naslund, who was picnicking with friends. Using the same story about needing help with his sailboat, he convinced her to come with him to his car. Like Ott, she disappeared without a trace. The fact that Bundy had taken two victims from the same location on the same day demonstrated a level of confidence and recklessness that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The Lake Sammamish incident was a turning point in the investigation. For the first time, investigators had multiple eyewitness accounts of the suspect. The descriptions were consistent: a good-looking young man in his 20s, well-dressed, charming, driving a tan Volkswagen Beetle. Most importantly, several witnesses had heard him introduce himself as Ted. The composite sketch released by police based on these eyewitness accounts showed a clean-cut, attractive man who looked like he could be anyone's neighbor or classmate. This was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case, the realization that the killer didn't look like a monster. He looked normal, trustworthy, even appealing. It was a revelation that would change how people thought about serial killers forever. The remains of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund were discovered on September 7, 1974, in a wooded area near Issaquah, Washington. The discovery site also contained the remains of other victims, creating what investigators would later describe as Bundy's first known body dump site. The condition of the remains suggested that Bundy had been returning to the site regularly, possibly to relive his crimes or to further desecrate the bodies. The psychological profile that emerged from these early crimes painted a picture of a killer unlike any law enforcement had encountered before. Bundy was organized, intelligent, and able to function normally in society while committing horrific crimes. He didn't fit the typical profile of a serial killer that investigators had been trained to recognize. He was educated, articulate, and politically active. He worked at a crisis hotline, helping people in distress while simultaneously planning his next attack. The investigation revealed that Bundy had been carefully studying his victims before striking. He knew their routines, their vulnerabilities, their schedules. He had turned stalking into an art form, spending weeks or even months observing potential victims before making his move. This level of premeditation was unprecedented in serial killing cases and suggested a mind that was both brilliant and utterly without conscience. As 1974 drew to a close, investigators across the Pacific Northwest were beginning to understand that they were dealing with something unprecedented. The careful planning, the mobility across state lines, the ability to blend into normal society while committing horrific crimes, all suggested a new type of criminal. Ted Bundy wasn't just a killer, he was an evolution in criminal behavior, a predator perfectly adapted to exploit the trust and openness of modern society. The young women who had disappeared weren't random victims. They were carefully selected targets chosen for their resemblance to the woman who had broken Bundy's heart years earlier. Each murder was both a crime of opportunity and an act of revenge against a woman who had rejected him. In his twisted mind, every victim was a surrogate for the one who had gotten away. As Ted Bundy's killing spree across the Pacific Northwest continued into 1975, law enforcement agencies began connecting the dots between disappearances that had initially seemed unrelated. The pattern was becoming undeniable, yet the killer remained frustratingly elusive. What investigators didn't realize was that Bundy was already adapting, evolving his methods, and preparing to expand his hunting grounds far beyond the familiar territory of Washington and Oregon. The investigation into the Washington murders had grown massive by this point. Multiple jurisdictions were sharing information, witness statements were being cross-referenced, and the composite sketch of the suspect known as Ted was circulating throughout the region. But Bundy possessed something that made him particularly dangerous, a keen awareness of investigative procedures and an ability to stay one step ahead of the authorities pursuing him. During this period, Bundy made a calculated decision that would prove pivotal to his criminal career. He relocated to Utah, ostensibly to attend law school at the University of Utah. This move wasn't just about education, it was about survival. The heat in Washington was intensifying, and Bundy recognized that his familiar hunting grounds were becoming too risky. Utah offered him a fresh start, new victims, and most importantly, a clean slate with local law enforcement who had no reason to suspect him. The transition to Utah marked a significant shift in Bundy's methodology. Gone were the daylight abductions at crowded locations like Lake Sammamish. In Utah, he became more sophisticated, more cautious, and arguably more dangerous. He began targeting women in different circumstances, often approaching them in parking lots, shopping centers, or near their homes. His approach remained consistent: the fake injury, the request for help, the disarming charm. But the execution became more refined. Bundy's first known Utah victim was Nancy Wilcox, an attractive 16-year-old who disappeared in October 1974. She was last seen leaving a party in Holiday, Utah, and simply vanished without a trace. Her disappearance barely registered with local authorities initially, another runaway teenager in a state that saw plenty of them. But Nancy wasn't a runaway. She was Bundy's first victim in what would become a new chapter of terror. The pattern in Utah followed a familiar but evolved blueprint. Bundy would scout potential victims, often returning to the same locations multiple times to observe routines and identify opportunities. He had learned from his experiences in Washington that preparation was everything. He knew which parking lots had poor lighting, which apartment complexes had easy access and exit routes, and which areas of town were less likely to have witnesses. Laura Amy became another casualty of Bundy's Utah operations. The 17-year-old disappeared after leaving a cafe in Lehi, Utah, in October 1974. Her body was found weeks later in American Fork Canyon, showing signs of blunt force trauma. The discovery sent shockwaves through the local community, but investigators still hadn't connected her murder to the string of disappearances plaguing the region. What made Bundy particularly effective during this period was his ability to blend into the Mormon culture that dominated Utah. He understood the importance of appearing respectable, trustworthy, and morally upright. He attended law school, participated in study groups, and even worked at a crisis hotline where he counseled people in distress. The irony was lost on no one later that while he was providing comfort to those in crisis, he was simultaneously creating the very tragedies that would drive others to seek help. The crisis hotline work deserves particular attention because it reveals the depth of Bundy's psychological manipulation. He genuinely seemed to enjoy helping people through their darkest moments, not out of compassion, but because it fed his need for control and superiority. He was playing God, deciding who lived and who died, who deserved comfort and who deserved terror. The psychological satisfaction he derived from this dual existence was intoxicating. As 1974 turned into 1975, Bundy's confidence grew. He had successfully established himself in a new state, resumed his killing, and maintained his carefully constructed public persona. But this confidence would ultimately prove to be his downfall. The more comfortable he became, the more risks he was willing to take, and the more likely he was to make the kind of mistake that would finally bring him to justice. The mistake came in the form of Carol Daranch, a young woman who would become one of the most important witnesses in the Bundy case. On November 8, 1975, Daranch was approached by Bundy at a shopping mall in Murray, Utah. He posed as a police officer, claiming that someone had attempted to break into her car and that she needed to come with him to the police station to file a report. His performance was convincing enough that Daranch initially complied, but as they walked through the mall, something felt wrong. When they reached Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle, Daranch's instincts screamed danger. The car didn't look like an unmarked police vehicle, and Bundy's behavior had become increasingly erratic. When he attempted to force handcuffs on her, she fought back with a ferocity that caught him off guard. The struggle was brief but intense, and Daranch managed to escape, running back toward the mall while Bundy fled in his car. For the first time in his criminal career, Bundy had left behind a living witness who could identify him. Daranch's description was detailed and accurate, and her account of the incident provided investigators with crucial insights into Bundy's methods. More importantly, she had seen his face clearly, heard his voice, and could identify him in a lineup. The Daranch incident marked the beginning of the end for Bundy's Utah operations, though he didn't realize it at the time. Law enforcement now had a concrete case to investigate, a living victim who could testify, and a clear description of both the perpetrator and his vehicle. The net was closing, but Bundy remained oblivious to the danger he was in. That same evening, as if to prove his recklessness, Bundy struck again. 17-year-old Deborah Kent disappeared from a high school in Bountiful, Utah, after leaving a play to pick up her brother. She was never seen alive again, and her body was never recovered. The timing of her disappearance, just hours after the Durant incident, would later become crucial evidence linking Bundy to both crimes. The investigation into these Utah incidents was more thorough and coordinated than anything Bundy had faced before. Utah law enforcement had learned from the mistakes made in Washington, and they were determined not to let another serial killer slip through their fingers. They compiled witness statements, analyzed physical evidence, and began building a comprehensive profile of their suspect. What they discovered was disturbing. The man they were hunting was intelligent, educated, and capable of extraordinary deception. He could assume different personas at will, adapt his approach based on circumstances, and maintain a facade of normalcy that fooled even those closest to him. This wasn't a disorganized killer driven by impulse. This was a predator who planned meticulously and executed with clinical precision. The breakthrough came in August 1975 when Bundy was pulled over by a Utah Highway Patrol officer in the early morning hours. The officer, suspicious of Bundy's behavior and the items found in his car, arrested him on suspicion of burglary. Among the items recovered were handcuffs, a crowbar, rope, and a ski mask, tools that would later be linked to his crimes. Initially, Bundy was released on bail, but the investigation continued. Carol Durant was brought in to view a lineup, and she immediately identified Bundy as her attacker. For the first time, law enforcement had a solid case against the man they suspected of being responsible for multiple murders across several states. The arrest sent shockwaves through the communities where Bundy had operated. Wow. Here was a man who had walked among them, attended their schools, worked in their offices, and volunteered at their crisis centers, all while harboring the darkest of secrets. The revelation forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evil, that it doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs and warnings. By 1975, Ted Bundy had become one of the most wanted men in America, but his reign of terror was far from over. The evidence was mounting, the net was closing, and yet somehow this master manipulator would find ways to slip through the cracks of the justice system not once, but twice. What followed were escapes so audacious, so carefully planned, that they would cement his place in criminal history while unleashing his most savage impulses on an unsuspecting population. The conviction for kidnapping Carol Durant in Utah was just the beginning. As investigators from multiple states began connecting the dots, they realized they weren't dealing with a simple kidnapper or even a typical murderer. They were hunting a predator who had methodically stalked victims across state lines, leaving a trail of bodies that stretched from Washington to Colorado. The scope of his crimes was staggering, and the evidence was finally starting to catch up with him. In Colorado, authorities had been piecing together the murder of Karen Campbell, a young nurse who had vanished from the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass during a ski vacation. Her body was discovered weeks later in the mountains, bearing the brutal injuries that had become Bundy's signature. When FBI technicians dismantled his tan Volkswagen Beetle, they found hair samples that matched Campbell's. It was the physical evidence they needed to link him directly to murder. The multi-state investigation was unprecedented in its scope. Over 30 investigators from different jurisdictions converged in Aspen in November 1976, sharing information and comparing notes. By the end of that meeting, they were certain they had their man. The pattern was undeniable, the evidence compelling, and the geographic spread of the crimes painted a picture of a killer who had been operating with impunity for years. Bundy was charged with Karen Campbell's murder and extradited to Colorado in January 1977. But this wasn't the broken, defeated criminal that authorities expected. Instead, they found a man who seemed energized by the legal process, someone who viewed his trials not as a reckoning, but as a stage for his performance. He insisted on representing himself, a decision that would prove both his arrogance and his undoing. The Colorado legal system, perhaps unwittingly, played right into his hands. As his own attorney, Bundy was granted privileges that regular prisoners didn't enjoy. He was allowed access to the law library, could remove his shackles during court proceedings, and was given a level of freedom that seemed almost absurd given the charges against him. But to the legal system, he was still presumed innocent, still entitled to due process, still deserving of the rights afforded to any defendant. On June 7, 1977, Bundy made his first escape attempt. During a recess in his murder trial, he asked to use the law library in the Pitkin County Courthouse. The guards, accustomed to his scholarly demeanor and legal research, saw nothing unusual in the request. But Bundy had been planning this moment for weeks, studying the building's layout, timing the guards' routines, and preparing for his opportunity. When the moment came, he simply walked to the second-story window of the law library and jumped. The 25-foot drop to the ground below could have killed him, but Bundy landed hard and kept running. He disappeared into the Colorado wilderness, triggering one of the most intense manhunts in the state's history. The escape sent shockwaves through the community. Schools were closed, gun and ammunition sales were halted, and a sense of panic gripped the region. This wasn't just any escaped prisoner, this was a suspected serial killer who had intimate knowledge of the local terrain and had already proven his ability to kill without detection. The fact that he had escaped in broad daylight from a courthouse only added to the terror. For 6 days, Bundy remained free, surviving in the mountains, using skills he had learned during his outdoor activities in Washington. He later described the experience as exhilarating, a return to the wilderness that had always been his sanctuary. But the harsh Colorado terrain and the massive search effort eventually took their toll. Cold, hungry, and exhausted, he was recaptured and returned to custody. The escape had several consequences. First, it demonstrated that Bundy was far more dangerous and resourceful than anyone had imagined. Second, it turned him into a folk hero among certain segments of the population who saw him as a clever, anti-establishment figure rather than a cold-blooded killer. T-shirts were printed, songs were written, and his escape became the stuff of local legend. But perhaps most importantly, it showed Bundy that escape was possible. The system that was supposed to contain him had failed, and he had tasted freedom. From that moment forward, he began planning his next attempt, one that would be far more sophisticated and ultimately more successful. Security was increased after his recapture, but Bundy had learned valuable lessons from his first escape. He studied the new jail in Glenwood Springs, where he was being held, identifying its weaknesses and developing a more elaborate plan. This time, he wouldn't rely on a spontaneous jump from a window. This time, he would disappear completely. The second escape began months before it was executed. Bundy had been secretly collecting money with help from his girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, who had moved to Colorado to be near him. He acquired detailed plans of the jail, obtained a hacksaw, and began the painstaking process of cutting through the ceiling of his cell. Most remarkably, he embarked on a strict diet, losing 35 pounds so he could fit through the small opening he was creating. On December 30th, 1977, while most of the jail staff were on Christmas vacation, Bundy put his plan into action. He arranged books and pillows under his blanket to create the illusion of a sleeping figure, then squeezed through the hole he had cut in the ceiling. Moving through the crawl space above the jail, he made his way to the jailer's apartment within the building. There, he stole civilian clothes and walked out the front door of the jail. This escape was different from the first. There was no immediate alarm, no massive search, no sense of urgency. It took 17 hours before guards discovered he was missing, giving him a substantial head start. By the time the manhunt began, Bundy was already hundreds of miles away, having stolen a car and begun his journey to freedom. The escape route took him first to Denver, then to Chicago, and finally to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he spent several days in a college town environment that reminded him of his University of Washington days. But Michigan was too cold, too unfamiliar, and too far from the hunting grounds he preferred. He needed to get to Florida, where the warm weather, transient population, and college campuses would provide perfect cover for his activities. The journey to Florida was a cross-country odyssey that demonstrated both his desperation and his cunning. He traveled by bus, train, and stolen car, always staying one step ahead of the authorities who were now frantically searching for him. He used false identities, paid cash for everything, and avoided any situation that might require him to show identification. By January 1978, Bundy had reached Tallahassee, Florida, home to Florida State University. The campus environment was perfect for his needs, populated by thousands of young women who matched his preferred victim profile. The warm climate meant people kept their windows open, security was more relaxed, and the general atmosphere was one of carefree college life. But something had changed in Bundy during his time as a fugitive. The careful planning and methodical approach that had characterized his earlier crimes were giving way to something more frenzied and desperate. The pressure of being hunted, combined with his escalating psychological needs, was pushing him toward a level of violence that even he had never reached before. The freedom he had fought so hard to achieve was about to become the catalyst for his most brutal and ultimately self-destructive acts. In Florida, far from the familiar territory of the Pacific Northwest, Bundy's would unleash a final spree of violence that would shock even seasoned investigators and finally bring his reign of terror to an end. The stage was set for the most horrific chapter in the Ted Bundy story, one that would take place in the early morning hours of January 15th, 1978, in a sorority house that should have been a safe haven for young women pursuing their education. Instead, it would become the scene of unimaginable brutality and the beginning of the end for one of America's most notorious serial killers. By the time Bundy landed in Florida, he had already proven himself capable of remarkable cunning. His 2 escapes from Colorado custody weren't just lucky breaks. They were calculated moves by a man who understood that his freedom was rapidly slipping away. The second escape, in particular, demonstrated his methodical planning. He had spent months preparing, losing 35 pounds to squeeze through a ceiling crawl space, accumulating $500 through his girlfriend, and studying the jail's layout with obsessive precision. When he finally walked out of that Glenwood Springs facility on a quiet December night in 1977, he wasn't just escaping prison. He was entering the final, most violent chapter of his killing spree. Florida represented something different for Bundy. Gone were the careful stalking patterns of his Washington victims. Gone was the calculated charm he'd used to lure young women to their deaths. What emerged in Tallahassee was a man operating under immense pressure, a fugitive whose facade of normalcy was cracking under the weight of his circumstances. The meticulous predator who had once spent weeks selecting victims was now acting on impulse, driven by an escalating need for violence that seemed to consume him entirely. The Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University became the stage for Bundy's most brutal crimes. On the night of January 15th, 1978, he transformed from a careful serial killer into something far more terrifying. In less than 15 minutes, he turned what should have been a safe haven for young women into a scene of unimaginable horror. The attack wasn't just about murder anymore. It was about unleashing years of pent-up rage, about exercising absolute control over helpless victims, about satisfying urges that had grown beyond his ability to contain them. 21-year-old Margaret Bowman was sleeping peacefully when Bundy entered her room. He beat her to death with a piece of firewood, the violence so savage that it left investigators struggling to process what they were seeing. But it was his attack on Lisa Levy that revealed the true depths of his depravity. The 20-year-old student became the victim of not just murder, but of sexual violence so extreme that it defied comprehension. Bundy bit her buttocks with such force that the mark became crucial evidence in his eventual conviction. He violated her with a hairspray bottle, turning an everyday object into an instrument of torture. The randomness of the attacks was perhaps what made them so terrifying. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, the two survivors, had done nothing to attract Bundy's attention. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, victims of a man who had abandoned any pretense of method or reason. Their survival was nothing short of miraculous, though both bore physical and psychological scars that would last a lifetime. But Bundy wasn't finished. His bloodlust unsatisfied, he fled the sorority house and continued his rampage just blocks away. Cheryl Thomas, another Florida State student, was asleep in her apartment when Bundy broke in. The attack left her with permanent disabilities, her life forever altered by those few minutes of violence. The speed and brutality of these attacks demonstrated that Bundy had crossed a line from which there was no return. The careful killer, who had once prided himself on leaving no evidence, was now acting with reckless abandon. The murder of Kimberly Leach represented the final degradation of whatever humanity remained in Bundy. The 12-year-old girl was simply walking to meet a friend when Bundy spotted her outside her Lake City school. In broad daylight, with witnesses nearby, he approached her with the same casual confidence he'd once used to lure college students. But Kimberly was just a child, innocent and trusting in a way that made Bundy's crime even more heinous. What happened to Kimberly in the final hours of her life remains one of the most disturbing aspects of Bundy's entire killing spree. Her body, found weeks later in Suwannee River State Park, showed evidence of sexual assault and murder. The fact that Bundy could look at a 12-year-old girl and see not innocence, but opportunity revealed the complete absence of any moral compass. This wasn't just about power or control anymore. This was about the total destruction of everything decent and human. The investigation that followed moved with unprecedented speed. Bundy's previous escapes had made him a priority target for law enforcement across multiple states. His photograph was circulated widely, his methods studied and cataloged. When reports of the Chi Omega attacks reached investigators, they immediately recognized the signature brutality that had marked his previous crimes. The bite mark evidence, in particular, provided a direct link between Bundy and the murders that would prove impossible to dispute. His capture came not through brilliant detective work, but through simple police procedure. A routine traffic stop in Pensacola revealed a man driving a stolen vehicle, carrying false identification and exhibiting the nervous behavior of someone with much to hide. When the officer realized he had apprehended one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives, the final chapter of Bundy's killing spree came to an abrupt end. The Florida crimes represented more than just the culmination of Bundy's criminal career. They revealed the ultimate destination of his psychological journey. The charming law student who had once fooled friends, colleagues, and even police officers was gone. In his place stood a man consumed by violence, incapable of seeing other human beings as anything more than objects to be used and discarded. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath. What made Bundy's Florida rampage particularly chilling was its contrast with his earlier crimes. The careful stalking, the elaborate ruses, the meticulous disposal of evidence, all of that had been abandoned in favor of pure, uncontrolled violence. It was as if the pressure of being a fugitive had caused whatever psychological mechanisms had previously contained his urges to completely collapse. The result was a killing spree that shocked even seasoned investigators who thought they had seen everything. The survivors of Bundy's Florida attacks faced a long road to recovery. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological trauma lingered. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner had to rebuild their lives, knowing that they had stared into the face of pure evil and somehow lived to tell about it. Cheryl Thomas struggled with the permanent disabilities left by her attack, a daily reminder of that terrible night. Their courage in testifying against Bundy helped ensure that justice would finally be served. The families of Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach faced a different kind of struggle. Their loved ones were gone forever, victims of a man whose capacity for evil seemed to know no bounds. The legal proceedings that followed would bring some measure of justice, but nothing could restore what had been lost. The vibrant young women who had their whole lives ahead of them were reduced to evidence in a courtroom, their dreams and aspirations silenced by one man's insatiable need for violence. Bundy's Florida crimes marked the end of one of the most terrifying killing sprees in American history. But they also represented something else, the final proof that beneath the charming exterior, behind the law school education and the political connections, lurked a predator whose appetite for violence could never be satisfied. The man who had once convinced people he was incapable of such crimes had finally shown the world exactly what he was capable of. And what he was capable of was far worse than anyone had imagined. By February 1978, Ted Bundy had finally been cornered. After his second escape from Colorado custody and his brutal rampage through Florida, law enforcement agencies across multiple states had mobilized every resource to track him down. The manhunt was unprecedented in its scope, with FBI agents, local police departments, and task forces all working around the clock to capture one of America's most dangerous fugitives. The beginning of the end came on February 12, 1978, in the early morning hours in Pensacola, Florida. Bundy was driving a stolen orange Volkswagen Beetle, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the Chi Omega crime scene. He had been living on the run for weeks, sleeping in stolen cars, breaking into homes for food, and constantly looking over his shoulder. The pressure was getting to him, and his usually meticulous planning had devolved into panicked improvisation. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Pensacola police officer David Lee was patrolling a quiet residential neighborhood when he noticed the orange Beetle driving erratically. The car was weaving slightly, and something about the driver's behavior triggered Lee's instincts. He ran the license plate through dispatch and discovered the vehicle had been reported stolen. Without hesitation, Lee activated his emergency lights and attempted to pull the car over. What happened next would become one of the most dramatic arrests in criminal history. Instead of stopping, Bundy floored the accelerator and took off through the empty streets of Pensacola. The chase was brief but intense, with Bundy running red lights and taking corners at dangerous speeds. His desperation was palpable as he tried everything to escape what he knew would be his final capture. The chase ended when Bundy lost control of the Beetle and crashed into a curb. Officer Lee approached the vehicle with his weapon drawn, expecting a violent confrontation. Instead, he found a disheveled, exhausted man who seemed almost relieved that his run was finally over. When Lee asked for identification, Bundy initially gave a false name, but the deception was half-hearted. The fight had gone out of him. At the police station, Bundy's true identity was quickly confirmed through fingerprints. The man who had terrorized multiple states for nearly 4 years was finally in custody. News of his capture spread rapidly through law enforcement circles, and within hours, investigators from Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Florida were converging on Pensacola. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic compared to the magnitude of Bundy's crimes. Here was a man who had brutally murdered dozens of young women, who had escaped from custody twice, who had manipulated and charmed his way across the country, leaving a trail of death and destruction. Yet in that moment, sitting in the Pensacola jail, he looked like what he had always been underneath the mask, a broken, pathetic individual whose reign of terror had finally come to an end. During his initial interrogation, Bundy was characteristically evasive and manipulative. He denied any involvement in the Florida murders, despite overwhelming evidence linking him to the Chi Omega sorority house and the death of Kimberly Leach. He attempted to charm his interrogators, falling back on the same tactics that had served him so well in the past. But this time was different. Law enforcement had learned from their previous encounters with Bundy, and they were prepared for his psychological games. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite mark analysis would later match his teeth to wounds found on Lisa Levy's body at the Chi Omega house. eyewitness testimony placed him at the scene of Kimberly Leach's abduction. His stolen credit cards had been used at locations that corresponded with the timeline of his crimes. The web of evidence was so tight that even Bundy's considerable powers of manipulation couldn't create reasonable doubt. As news of his capture spread to the media, the public reaction was intense. Bundy had become a household name, a symbol of the evil that could lurk behind a charming facade. His arrest brought a sense of relief to communities across the country, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where his killing spree had begun. Families of victims finally had hope that justice would be served. The legal proceedings that followed would be equally dramatic. Bundy's trials would become media circuses, with the defendant representing himself and turning the courtroom into a stage for his narcissistic performances. But the evidence was undeniable, and the juries would ultimately see through his manipulations to the monster beneath. The capture of Ted Bundy marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal careers in American history. From his first known attack on Karen Sparks in 1974 to his final capture in 1978, he had left a trail of death and terror that spanned multiple states and claimed at least 30 lives. His ability to blend into society, to appear normal and even charming while harboring such darkness, had made him particularly dangerous. But perhaps most importantly, his capture demonstrated that no matter how cunning or manipulative a criminal might be, law enforcement's persistence and dedication to justice would ultimately prevail. The investigation that led to Bundy's downfall involved hundreds of officers, thousands of hours of detective work, and the cooperation of multiple jurisdictions. It was a testament to the fact that even the most elusive predators could be brought to justice. Ted Bundy's story serves as a chilling reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary individuals. His crimes shocked the nation and forever changed how we understand the psychology of serial killers. But his capture and eventual conviction also demonstrated that justice, though sometimes delayed, would ultimately be served. By 1978, Ted Bundy had escaped from custody twice, crossed multiple state lines, and unleashed a reign of terror that would culminate in his most brutal acts yet. His final capture in Florida marked the end of a killing spree that had terrorized the nation for years, but the legal battles that followed would prove just as captivating as the crimes themselves. After his second escape from Colorado in December 1977, Bundy had made his way to Florida, where he committed the horrific Chi Omega sorority house murders and killed 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. His reckless behavior in those final weeks of freedom would ultimately lead to his downfall. On February 15, 1978, just over a month after his escape, Bundy was pulled over by Pensacola police officer David Lee in a routine traffic stop. The officer noticed the Volkswagen Beetle was driving erratically and discovered the car had been reported stolen. When Lee approached the vehicle, Bundy initially tried to run, but he was quickly apprehended. The man who had evaded capture for so long was finally back in custody. What followed was one of the most sensational legal proceedings in American history. Bundy's trials would become a media circus, broadcast live on television and watched by millions of Americans who were simultaneously horrified and fascinated by the articulate, charming defendant who stood accused of such heinous crimes. The contrast between Bundy's public persona and the brutal nature of his alleged crimes created a cognitive dissonance that captured the public imagination in ways that few criminal cases had before. The first trial began in June 1979 in Miami, focusing on the Chi Omega murders. Bundy, ever the narcissist, chose to represent himself, a decision that would prove both his downfall and his final stage for manipulation. He had attended law school and possessed enough legal knowledge to be dangerous, but his arrogance and need for control would ultimately work against him. The courtroom became his theater, and he relished the attention, often appearing more concerned with his public image than with mounting an effective defense. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of circumstantial evidence and forensic testimony that was groundbreaking for its time. Most damning was the bite mark evidence found on Lisa Levy's body. Forensic odontologist Dr. Richard Souveron testified that the bite marks on Levy's buttock matched Bundy's teeth perfectly, providing physical evidence that linked him directly to the crime scene. This was revolutionary forensic science for the late 1970s, and it would prove crucial in securing a conviction. The prosecution also presented testimony from survivors Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, who had lived through the Chi Omega attack. Their harrowing accounts of that night painted a picture of a man who had moved through the sorority house like a predator, striking with calculated violence before disappearing into the night. The testimony was devastating, providing first-hand accounts of Bundy's brutality that contradicted his carefully crafted public image. Throughout the trial, Bundy maintained his innocence while simultaneously seeming to enjoy the attention. He would often turn to face the cameras, flash his famous smile, and engage with the media in ways that seemed inappropriate for someone facing the death penalty. His behavior in court was erratic and self-defeating. He would object to testimony, cross-examine witnesses, and deliver rambling opening and closing statements that did little to advance his defense, but much to showcase his ego. The prosecution methodically built their case, presenting evidence of Bundy's presence in Tallahassee at the time of the murders, his access to the Chi Omega house, and the forensic evidence linking him to the crimes. They painted a picture of a man who had escalated his violence to unprecedented levels, driven by a need for control and a complete disregard for human life. The brutality of the Chi Omega murders shocked even seasoned investigators, representing a level of violence that surpassed his previous crimes. Bundy's defense was hampered by his own narcissism and his insistence on maintaining his innocence. Rather than presenting a coherent defense strategy, he seemed more interested in using the trial as a platform to demonstrate his intelligence and charm. He would often interrupt proceedings, make inappropriate comments, and generally behave in ways that alienated the jury and undermined his own case. His legal knowledge was sufficient to understand the proceedings, but insufficient to mount an effective defense against the overwhelming evidence. The trial also featured testimony about Bundy's psychological state. While he refused to cooperate with most psychological evaluations, experts testified about his behavior patterns and the profile of the killer they were seeking. Dr. Emmanuel Tenay, a forensic psychiatrist, testified that Bundy suffered from a severe personality disorder that made him incapable of assisting in his own defense, but the judge rejected this assessment and allowed the trial to continue. On July 23, 1979, after deliberating for less than 7 hours, the jury found Theodore Robert Bundy guilty of the murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, as well as the attempted murders of Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. The verdict was delivered in a packed courtroom, with Bundy showing little emotion as the guilty verdicts were read. The jury had seen through his charm and manipulation, recognizing the monster behind the mask. The penalty phase of the trial was equally dramatic. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, citing the heinous nature of the crimes and the need to protect society from such a dangerous individual. They presented evidence of Bundy's pattern of violence and his complete lack of remorse. The defense, such as it was, attempted to present mitigating factors, but Bundy's own behavior had made such arguments nearly impossible to sustain. On July 31st, 1979, Judge Edward Cowell sentenced Theodore Bundy to death by electrocution. The judge's words were both condemnatory and strangely compassionate, acknowledging the waste of what could have been a productive life while recognizing the necessity of the ultimate punishment. "Take care of yourself, young man," Judge Cowell said, in a moment that would become one of the most quoted exchanges in criminal justice history. "I say that to you sincerely. It's a tragedy for this court to see such a total waste of humanity, but the legal proceedings were far from over. Bundy still faced trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach, and the appeals process would drag on for years. The Leach trial began in January 1980 in Orlando, and it would prove to be even more emotionally charged than the Chi Omega case. The victim was a child, and the evidence was equally damning. Witnesses had seen Bundy near the school where Kimberly disappeared, and forensic evidence linked him to the crime. The Leach trial was notable for the devastating testimony of the victim's mother, who described the impact of losing her daughter in heart-wrenching detail. The courtroom was often moved to tears as the prosecution presented evidence of how Bundy had lured the 12-year-old away from her school and subjected her to unimaginable terror before killing her. The defense attempted to challenge the evidence, but once again, Bundy's arrogance and need for control sabotaged their efforts. On February 7, 1980, Bundy was again found guilty of first-degree murder, this time for the killing of Kimberly Leach. He was sentenced to death for a second time, ensuring that even if one conviction was overturned, he would still face execution. The legal system had spoken definitively. Theodore Bundy would pay the ultimate price for his crimes. The years that followed were marked by a lengthy appeals process that would drag on for nearly a decade. Bundy's legal team, now consisting of competent attorneys rather than his own ego-driven representation, filed numerous appeals challenging various aspects of his conviction and sentence. They argued that he had been incompetent to represent himself, that the evidence was insufficient, and that the media attention had made a fair trial impossible. Each appeal was methodically rejected by higher courts. During this time, Bundy remained on death row at Florida State Prison, where he would spend the remainder of his life. He continued to maintain his innocence publicly, while privately beginning to acknowledge his crimes to investigators and journalists. The appeals process gave him what he had always craved: attention and control over his own narrative. He would grant interviews, write letters, and generally manipulate the media coverage of his case. The investigation into Ted Bundy's crimes was unlike anything law enforcement had ever encountered. Here was a killer who defied every stereotype, every profile they had developed over decades of police work. He wasn't a loner lurking in shadows. He wasn't visibly disturbed or socially awkward. Instead, He was the kind of man parents would trust with their daughters, the kind of neighbor who seemed helpful and reliable. But beneath that carefully constructed facade was something far more sinister. Bundy had spent years perfecting his act, studying human behavior, learning exactly what made people feel safe and trusting. He understood that charm was a weapon, that a smile could be more dangerous than a knife, and that people's natural inclination to help others could be turned against them with devastating effect. The evidence against him was mounting from multiple states. In Utah, there were the handcuffs, the ski mask, the crowbar found in his Volkswagen. There was Carol Durange, who had survived his attempted abduction and could identify him in a lineup. In Colorado, forensic technicians had found hair in his dismantled Beetle that matched victim Karen Campbell. The FBI had impounded his car and torn it apart piece by piece, finding traces that connected him to crimes across state lines. What made the case even more complex was Bundy's legal maneuvering. He had studied law, understood the system, and was determined to use every advantage he could find. He represented himself in court, turning his trials into performances where he could display his intelligence and charisma. He filed motion after motion, appealed every decision, and seemed to relish the attention his case was generating. The media coverage was unprecedented. Bundy had become a celebrity criminal, his good looks and articulate manner making him a subject of fascination rather than simple revulsion. Women sent him love letters in prison. Reporters competed for interviews. The public seemed unable to reconcile the charming man they saw in photographs with the brutal killer described in court documents. But the families of his victims saw through the facade. They understood that every smile, every charming gesture, every moment of apparent vulnerability was calculated. They knew that behind his friendly demeanor was someone who had stalked their daughters, sisters, and friends like prey. Someone who had used their trust and kindness as weapons against them. The investigation revealed the true scope of his crimes. Bodies were found in remote locations across multiple states, often in various stages of decomposition. Some victims were discovered months or even years after their disappearances. Others that were never found at all, their families left with nothing but questions and grief. Bundy's method was consistent across jurisdictions. He would approach young women, often college students, with some story about needing help. Sometimes he wore a cast on his arm, asking for assistance loading books into his car. Other times, he posed as a police officer or authority figure. He was skilled at reading people, at identifying those who were most likely to help a stranger in apparent distress. The Lake Sammamish incident had been a turning point. The daylight abduction of two women from a crowded beach demonstrated not just his boldness, but his confidence in his ability to manipulate people. Multiple witnesses had seen him, heard him introduce himself as Ted, noticed his Volkswagen Beetle. For the first time, investigators had a clear description and a name to work with. As the cases from different states came together, a pattern emerged that was both sophisticated and terrifying. Bundy wasn't just a serial killer. He was a student of murder who had refined his techniques over time. He planned meticulously, chose his victims carefully, and disposed of evidence with calculated precision. The psychological evaluation of Bundy revealed a man who understood exactly what he was doing, but felt no remorse for his actions. He could discuss his crimes in clinical detail, describe the planning that went into each attack, explain his methods for avoiding detection. What he couldn't or wouldn't explain was why he felt compelled to kill. His escapes from custody only added to his legend. The first escape from the Aspen courthouse was almost theatrical in its audacity. The second escape, through the ceiling of his jail cell, demonstrated the planning and patience that characterized all his criminal activities. He had spent months preparing, losing weight to fit through the opening, studying the jail's routine, waiting for the perfect moment. The flight to Florida marked the beginning of the end for Bundy. Away from familiar territory, operating under intense pressure as a fugitive, his careful methods began to break down. The Chi Omega murders were savage in a way that his earlier crimes had not been. The attack on the sorority house was frenzied, brutal, lacking the cold calculation that had characterized his previous killings. The murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach represented a new level of horror. Unlike his previous victims, who were typically college-aged women, Kimberly was a child. The crime seemed to indicate that whatever psychological mechanisms had governed his earlier killings were breaking down under the pressure of his fugitive status. When he was finally captured, driving a stolen vehicle and living under a false identity, the investigation into his crimes was far from over. Authorities from multiple states wanted him for questioning. Families of missing women hoped for answers. The public wanted to understand how someone who appeared so normal could commit such horrific acts. The trial preparations revealed the full extent of the evidence against him. Bite mark analysis, a relatively new forensic technique, linked him definitively to the Florida murders. Hair and fiber evidence connected him to crimes across multiple states. Witness testimony placed him at or near the scenes of numerous disappearances, but perhaps the most damning evidence was Bundy's own behavior, his constant attempts to manipulate the legal system, his grandiose self-representation in court, his apparent belief that he could charm his way out of any situation, all pointed to a narcissistic personality that viewed other people as objects to be used and discarded. The investigation into Ted Bundy changed law enforcement forever. It demonstrated the need for better communication between jurisdictions, the importance of psychological profiling in serial crime cases, and the value of new forensic techniques. It also revealed how a killer could hide in plain sight, using society's assumptions about what evil looks like to avoid detection for years. Most importantly, it showed that the greatest monsters are often those who appear most human, most trustworthy, most like the people we encounter every day. Bundy's true horror wasn't just in what he did to his victims, but in how he exploited the very qualities that make society function: trust, kindness, and the willingness to help others in need. By early 1978, Ted Bundy had become a ghost haunting the Florida night. His second escape from Colorado had given him something he'd never truly possessed before: complete freedom from oversight, from schedules, from anyone who might question his movements. He was invisible, drifting through a state where nobody knew his face, nobody expected him to be anywhere at any particular time. It was this anonymity that made him so incredibly dangerous. The man who arrived in Tallahassee in January 1978 was different from the calculated killer who had terrorized the Pacific Northwest. Prison had changed him, not rehabilitated him, but stripped away whatever restraint he'd once possessed. The careful planning that had characterized his earlier murders was gone, replaced by something far more primal and terrifying. He was no longer hunting for the perfect victim or the perfect moment. He was simply hunting. Florida State University provided the perfect hunting ground. The campus was sprawling, filled with young women living independently for the first time. Sorority houses dotted the landscape, their residents trusting in the safety of numbers and the illusion of security that came with being part of a community. But Bundy understood something that these young women didn't. Communities could be penetrated, and trust could be weaponized. The Chi Omega sorority house at 6061 West Jefferson Street was a typical college residence. Built in the 1920s, it housed dozens of young women who had come to Florida State to build their futures. They studied together, socialized together, and felt safe together. The house had basic security measures, but like most college residences, it relied more on the assumption of safety than on actual protection. On the night of January 14, 1978, that assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. Bundy had been watching. He'd spent days observing the patterns of the house, noting when lights went out, when the last residents returned from late nights out, when the building settled into the quiet vulnerability of sleep. He'd identified the back door with its faulty lock, the entry point that would allow him to slip inside undetected. What happened next would become one of the most notorious crimes in American history, not just for its brutality, but for its randomness. This wasn't the careful stalking of a specific victim that had characterized his earlier murders. This was something else entirely, a frenzy of violence that seemed to have no logic beyond the killer's need to destroy. Around 2:45 a.m. on January 15th, Bundy entered the Chi Omega house. The building was quiet, its residents deep in sleep after a typical Saturday night of studying and socializing. He moved through the darkened hallways with the confidence of someone who belonged there, his footsteps silent on the carpeted floors. His first victim was Margaret Bowman, a 21-year-old from St. Petersburg. She was a junior majoring in recreation, known for her kindness and her infectious laugh. She was sleeping peacefully when Bundy entered her room. He killed her with a piece of firewood, beating her so savagely that her skull was fractured. He then strangled her with a nylon stocking, ensuring that there would be no possibility of survival. From Margaret's room, he moved to the room of Lisa Levy, a 20-year-old from St. Petersburg studying fashion merchandising. Lisa was everything that seemed to trigger Bundy's rage. Young, attractive, with long dark hair parted in the middle. But what he did to Lisa went beyond even his previous crimes. He beat her unconscious, then committed acts of violence so depraved that they shocked even seasoned investigators. He sexually assaulted her with a hairspray bottle, bit deeply into her buttock, and tore at her body with a savagery that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human rage. But Bundy wasn't finished. He moved to the room of Karen Chandler, a 21-year-old from Tallahassee. Karen was awakened by the sound of her roommate Kathy Kleiner moaning. In the darkness, she saw a figure standing over Kathy's bed, a club raised above his head. Before she could scream, Bundy turned on her, striking her repeatedly with what appeared to be a wooden club. Karen's jaw was broken, her skull fractured, but somehow she remained conscious. Kathy Kleiner, a 20-year-old from Miami, was next. Bundy beat her with the same wooden club, breaking her jaw and knocking out several teeth. Like Karen, She was critically injured but alive. The sounds of the attack finally began to wake other residents of the house. The entire rampage lasted less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes in which Bundy transformed a safe haven into a scene of unimaginable horror. As he heard movement in other parts of the house, voices calling out in alarm, he fled through the same back door he'd entered, but his night of terror wasn't over. Still in the grip of whatever frenzy had driven him to attack the Chi Omega house, Bundy ran through the streets of Tallahassee until he reached Dunwoody Street, just a few blocks away. There, he broke into the apartment of Cheryl Thomas, a 21-year-old dance student at Florida State. Cheryl was sleeping when Bundy entered her apartment. He beat her with a club, fracturing her skull and causing permanent hearing damage. But something interrupted him, perhaps the sound of neighbors or approaching sirens from the Chi Omega house. He fled, leaving Cheryl unconscious but alive. The discovery of the crimes sent shockwaves through the Florida State University community and beyond. 4 young women had been attacked in their beds, 2 of them killed, in what should have been the safety of their own homes. The brutality of the attacks was unlike anything local law enforcement had encountered. The investigation began immediately, but Bundy had left few clues. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses who had seen him enter or leave the buildings. The only evidence was the terrible damage he'd inflicted and a few fibers that crime scene investigators carefully collected from the victims' bodies. What investigators didn't know was that the man responsible for these horrors was already planning his next attack. The Chi Omega murders had satisfied something in Bundy, but only temporarily. The hunger that drove him was still there, and it would soon demand another victim. The media coverage of the Chi Omega murders was intense and immediate. News of the attacks spread across the country, bringing national attention to what had been a local tragedy. The brutality of the crimes, combined with the vulnerability of the victims, created a story that captured the public imagination in the most horrifying way. For the families of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, the media attention was both a blessing and a curse. It kept the investigation in the public eye, but it also meant that their daughters' deaths became public property, discussed and analyzed by strangers who had never known them as living, breathing human beings. The survivors, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, faced a different kind of hell. They had to live with the physical and psychological trauma of their attacks while knowing that their assailant was still free, still capable of striking again. Both women would require extensive medical treatment and years of therapy to recover from what Bundy had done to them. Cheryl Thomas, the lone survivor of the Dunwoody Street attack, suffered permanent hearing damage and ongoing health problems as a result of her injuries. Like Karen and Kathy, she would spend years trying to rebuild her life after encountering pure evil in the form of Ted Bundy. The Chi Omega murders marked a turning point in Bundy's criminal career. The careful planning and methodical approach that had characterized his earlier crimes were gone, replaced by frenzied violence that seemed to come from a place beyond rational thought. It was as if his time in prison and his subsequent escapes had stripped away whatever thin veneer of humanity he'd once possessed. But perhaps most terrifyingly, the murders demonstrated that Bundy was capable of even greater violence than anyone had imagined. The man who had once relied on charm and manipulation to lure his victims had become someone willing to break into homes and attack sleeping women with clubs and whatever other weapons he could find. The investigation into the Chi Omega murders would eventually lead to Bundy's capture, but not before he would claim one more victim. The monster who had terrorized the Pacific Northwest, Utah, and Colorado had brought his reign of terror to Florida, and he wasn't finished yet. As news of the attacks spread, women across the Florida State University campus began to take precautions they'd never thought necessary. Doors were locked, windows were secured, and many students began sleeping in groups, afraid to be alone in the darkness. The sense of safety that had once characterized college life was shattered, replaced by a fear that seemed to lurk in every shadow. The Chi Omega murders would become one of the most studied crimes in American history, not just for their brutality, but for what they revealed about the mind of a killer who had completely abandoned any pretense of humanity. They showed that Ted Bundy was capable of violence beyond anything he'd previously demonstrated, and they provided crucial evidence that would eventually help convict him. But for the families of the victims, for the survivors, and for the community that had been terrorized, the Chi Omega murders were more than just a case study in criminal psychology. They were a reminder that evil could strike anywhere, at any time, and that the monsters we fear in our nightmares sometimes walk among us in broad daylight. As Ted Bundy's reign of terror reached its bloody crescendo in Florida, the final act of his criminal career would prove to be the most devastating and ultimately the most revealing. The charming law student who had once fooled friends, colleagues, and even law enforcement was now operating in a state of complete psychological breakdown. Gone was the methodical planner who had evaded capture for years. What remained was a desperate, frenzied killer whose mask had finally slipped away entirely. The brutality at the Chi Omega sorority house had shocked even seasoned investigators. In less than 15 minutes, Bundy had transformed a place of safety into a scene of unimaginable horror. The vicious attacks on Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, along with the assault on Cheryl Thomas, represented a new level of savagery that spoke to his deteriorating mental state. This wasn't the careful, calculating predator who had once lured victims with fake casts and requests for help. This was a man consumed by his own darkness, operating in a state of pure, uncontrolled violence. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Bundy's final spree was yet to come. Just weeks after the sorority house massacre, he would commit what many consider his most heinous act, the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. The abduction took place in broad daylight at her school in Lake City, Florida. Witnesses saw a man matching Bundy's description approach the young girl, and then she simply vanished. For 2 agonizing months, her family held on to hope, clinging to the possibility that she might still be alive somewhere. The discovery of Kimberly's remains in Suwannee River State Park would mark the end of any illusions about Ted Bundy's capacity for evil. The murder of a child represented a crossing of a line that even hardened criminals rarely breach. It demonstrated that his violence had escalated beyond all boundaries, beyond any semblance of the selective targeting that had characterized his earlier crimes. Kimberly Leach wasn't a college student with long, dark hair who resembled his former girlfriend. She was simply a child in the wrong place at the wrong time, victimized by a man who who had lost all connection to humanity. The investigation into Kimberly's disappearance would ultimately provide some of the most damning evidence against Bundy. Witnesses at the school provided detailed descriptions of both the suspect and his vehicle. Forensic evidence from the stolen van he had been driving linked him directly to the crime scene. Perhaps most significantly, the timeline of events could be reconstructed with devastating precision, placing Bundy at the scene during the exact window when Kimberly disappeared. His final capture came not through brilliant detective work or an elaborate manhunt, but through the simple vigilance of a patrol officer who noticed something suspicious about a stolen Volkswagen Beetle in the early morning hours of February 15th, 1978. Officer David Lee pulled over the vehicle in Pensacola, initially suspecting nothing more than a routine traffic stop. The man behind the wheel was calm, polite, and seemed almost relieved to be caught. He provided a false name, but his fingerprints would soon reveal the truth. Ted Bundy, one of America's most wanted fugitives, was finally in custody. The arrest marked the end of a killing spree that had terrorized multiple states and claimed dozens of lives. But for investigators, it was just the beginning of a complex legal battle that would span years and captivate the nation. Bundy's trials would become a media circus, transforming a serial killer into a twisted celebrity and forever changing how America viewed both crime and justice. In custody, Bundy initially maintained his innocence, but his behavior revealed the calculating mind that had made him so dangerous. He studied the evidence against him with the intensity of the law student he had once been, looking for weaknesses, inconsistencies, anything that might create reasonable doubt. He fired his court-appointed attorneys and chose to represent himself, turning the courtroom into his personal stage. The trials that followed would introduce the American public to forensic techniques that seemed almost like science fiction. Bite mark analysis, a relatively new field in forensic odontology, would play a crucial role in linking Bundy to the Chi Omega murders. The bite marks found on Lisa Levy's body were photographed, measured, and compared to dental impressions taken from Bundy. The match was compelling enough to convince a jury, representing one of the first times such evidence had been successfully used in a major criminal trial. But perhaps more disturbing than the forensic evidence was Bundy's behavior throughout the proceedings. He seemed to relish the attention, treating the courtroom like a theater where he was the star performer. He cross-examined witnesses with a skill that reminded observers of his intelligence and charisma. He flirted with female reporters and maintained his innocence with such conviction that some observers began to question whether he might actually be telling the truth. This ability to manipulate perception, even while facing overwhelming evidence of his guilt, represented perhaps the most frightening aspect of Ted Bundy's personality. He understood that his survival depended not on proving his innocence, but on creating enough doubt to avoid the electric chair. Every smile, every moment of apparent vulnerability, every display of legal acumen was carefully calculated to serve this purpose. The prosecution, led by prosecutor Larry Simpson, methodically presented their case. Witness after witness and testified about Bundy's presence at various crime scenes. Survivors like Carol DeRanch courageously took the stand to describe their encounters with the man who had tried to kill them. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a picture of a predator who had operated across multiple states, leaving a trail of death and destruction in his wake. Yet even as the case against him mounted, Bundy continued to maintain his facade. He spoke eloquently about his rights, about the presumption of innocence, about the flaws in the justice system. To those who didn't know the full extent of his crimes, he could still appear sympathetic, even admirable. This was the final, most chilling demonstration of the charm that had made him so deadly. The guilty verdict, when it came, surprised no one who had followed the evidence. But the moment represented more than just the conviction of a serial killer. It marked the end of an era of innocence, a time when Americans could believe that monsters were easily recognizable, that evil announced itself with obvious signs. Ted Bundy had taught the nation a terrifying lesson about the banality of evil, about how darkness could hide behind the most ordinary, even appealing facade. As he was led away in shackles, Ted Bundy's true legacy was only beginning to emerge. The families of his victims would spend decades seeking closure, many never knowing for certain whether their loved ones had fallen prey to his violence. The survivors would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives, and the nation would grapple with uncomfortable questions about how such a monster could have operated undetected for so long. The case had revealed not just the mind of a killer, but the vulnerabilities of a society that wanted to believe in the fundamental goodness of humanity. Ted Bundy had exploited that faith, using our natural inclination to trust and help others as a weapon against his victims. In doing so, he had forever changed how Americans thought about personal safety, about trust, and about the potential for evil that might lurk behind even the most charming smile. February 15th, 1978. The sleepy college town of Tallahassee, Florida, would never be the same. For weeks, Ted Bundy had been living like a ghost in the shadows of Florida State University, hiding under the name Chris Hagen. His money was running out, his desperation mounting, and the monster inside him was clawing to get free. That night, as students slept peacefully in their beds, evil walked among them. At 2:47 a.m., Bundy approached the Chi Omega sorority house at 661 West Jefferson Street. The back door had a faulty lock, something he'd noticed during his careful surveillance of the building. He slipped inside like a phantom, carrying a piece of oak firewood he'd grabbed from outside. What happened next would become one of the most brutal and shocking crimes in American history. The house was silent except for the soft breathing of sleeping young women. Bundy moved through the hallways with predatory precision, his eyes adjusted to the darkness. He knew exactly where he was going. These were not random attacks. This was calculated savagery. His first victim was 21-year-old Margaret Bowman. She was asleep in her bed when Bundy entered her room. He struck her head with the firewood, then strangled her with a nylon stocking. The violence was swift and silent. Margaret never had a chance to scream, never had a chance to fight back. She was dead within minutes. But Bundy wasn't finished. The frenzy that had been building inside him for weeks was now unleashed. He moved to the next room, where 20-year-old Lisa Levy lay sleeping. What he did to Lisa was even more horrific. He bludgeoned her unconscious, then committed acts so depraved that even hardened investigators would struggle to process them. He bit her buttock so savagely that it left a clear impression, then sexually assaulted her with a hairspray bottle. Lisa died from her injuries, another bright life snuffed out by Bundy's insatiable hunger for violence. The sounds of the attack finally woke other residents. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, sleeping in nearby rooms, became Bundy's next targets. He attacked them both with the same wooden club, fracturing skulls and breaking bones. But something had changed. Maybe it was the noise, maybe it was the approaching dawn, but Bundy's methodical control was slipping. These attacks were frenzied, desperate, and sloppy. Both women survived, though they would carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Bundy fled the sorority house, but the monster wasn't satisfied. Less than an hour later, he broke into another apartment just blocks away. Cheryl Thomas, a 21-year-old dance student, was asleep when Bundy smashed her skull with a piece of firewood. She survived, but the attack left her with permanent hearing loss and a lifetime of trauma. In less than 15 minutes, Bundy had turned a peaceful college campus into a war zone. 2 young women were dead, 3 others brutally injured, and an entire community was terrorized. The Chi Omega murders marked a horrifying escalation in Bundy's violence. Gone was the careful, methodical killer who had stalked victims for months. This was something else entirely. This was a man completely consumed by his own darkness. The investigation began immediately. Physical evidence was more abundant than in any of Bundy's previous crimes. He had left bite marks, hair samples, and blood evidence throughout the crime scenes. For the first time in his killing career, Bundy had made mistakes, fatal mistakes, but he wasn't done killing. 3 weeks later, on February 9th, 1978, Bundy committed what would be his final murder. 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was walking across the grounds of Lake City Junior High School when she encountered the monster. Bundy, driving a stolen van, approached the young girl and somehow convinced her to get into his vehicle. What happened next remains one of the most heartbreaking chapters in this entire saga. Kimberly was just a child. She had her whole life ahead of her, dreams and aspirations that would never be fulfilled. Bundy drove her to a remote area where he sexually assaulted and murdered her. Her body was discovered weeks later in Suwannee River State Park, partially decomposed and bearing the horrific evidence of what had been done to her. The murder of Kimberly Leach represented the absolute nadir of Bundy's evil. This wasn't a college student who had made the mistake of trusting a charming stranger. This was a child taken from her school, murdered by a man who had already destroyed so many lives. The public outrage was immediate and intense. This was no longer just about catching a serial killer. This was about stopping a monster who had declared war on innocence itself. Meanwhile, Bundy's life as a fugitive was unraveling. He was running out of money, running out of places to hide, and running out of time. His stolen credit cards were being tracked, his fake identities were crumbling, and law enforcement agencies across multiple states were closing in. The net was tightening, and even someone as cunning as Bundy couldn't stay ahead of it forever. On February 15th, 1978, exactly 1 month after the Chi Omega murders, Bundy's luck finally ran out. He was driving a stolen Volkswagen Beetle through Pensacola, Florida, when Officer David Lee pulled him over for driving erratically. It should have been a routine traffic stop, but something about the driver made Lee suspicious. The man was nervous, evasive, and his story didn't add up. When Lee ran the license plate, he discovered the car was stolen. As he approached the vehicle to make an arrest, Bundy bolted. He ran through the streets of Pensacola with Lee in pursuit, but he was exhausted, malnourished, and his body was failing him. The man who had once been so careful, so methodical, so seemingly invincible, was finally brought down by his own desperation. As Lee tackled Bundy to the ground, the killer's first words were chilling in their banality. "I wish you had killed me," he said. It was a statement that would haunt investigators for years to come. Was this remorse? Was this the realization of what he had become? Or was it simply the frustration of a predator who knew his hunting days were over? The arrest made national headlines. Ted Bundy, the man who had terrorized multiple states, who had escaped from custody twice, who had murdered dozens of innocent people, was finally in chains. But even in defeat, he remained defiant. He refused to confess, refused to show remorse, and continued to maintain his innocence even as the evidence against him mounted. The physical evidence from the Chi Omega murders was overwhelming. Bundy's bite marks on Lisa Levy's body provided a direct forensic link that couldn't be disputed. Hair samples, blood evidence, and eyewitness testimony all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Ted Bundy was guilty of the most heinous crimes imaginable. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Bundy's final capture was how ordinary he seemed. Here was a man who had committed unspeakable acts of violence, who had destroyed countless lives, who had terrorized an entire nation. And yet, sitting in that jail cell, he looked like just another criminal. There was no visible mark of evil, no outward sign of the monster that lurked within. That, perhaps, was the most terrifying revelation of all. The mask had finally slipped. The charming law student, the helpful stranger, the concerned citizen was revealed for what he truly was: a predator who had used society's own decency against it. For years, Bundy had relied on people's willingness to trust, to help, to believe in the goodness of others. He had weaponized kindness and turned compassion into vulnerability. As Bundy sat in his cell awaiting trial, the full scope of his crimes began to emerge. Certain investigators from multiple states descended on Florida, bringing with them evidence and testimonies that painted a picture of a killing spree that had lasted nearly 4 years. The body count continued to rise as more victims were identified and more crimes were linked to the man who had once seemed so harmless. The nation watched in fascination and horror as the details of Bundy's crimes were revealed. This wasn't just another criminal case. This was a window into the darkest corners of human nature, a glimpse of evil that most people couldn't comprehend. Ted Bundy had become more than just a killer. He had become a symbol of everything that parents feared, everything that made people lock their doors at night, everything that reminded us that monsters don't always look like monsters. The final chapter of Ted Bundy's story was about to begin. The trials, the media circus, and the desperate attempts to avoid the electric chair all lay ahead. But in that moment, sitting in his cell in Pensacola, Florida, Ted Bundy's reign of terror was finally over. The monster had been caged, but the scars he had left on American society would last forever. Ted Bundy's final chapter began with a desperate flight across America, but even the most cunning predator eventually runs out of places to hide. After his second daring escape from Colorado custody in December 1977, Bundy had managed to slip through the cracks of law enforcement and disappear into the American landscape. He'd lost 35 pounds to squeeze through that jail ceiling, stolen clothes from his jailer's apartment, and walked out the front door while most of the staff were on Christmas vacation. It was a masterpiece of planning and execution, but it would also be his last taste of freedom. For weeks, Bundy moved like a ghost across the country. He hitchhiked, stole cars, and used fake identities to stay one step ahead of the massive manhunt that was closing in around him. He made his way to Michigan, then down to Florida, where the warm climate and transient population offered the perfect cover for someone trying to disappear. But Bundy couldn't disappear from himself. The urges that had driven him to kill were still there, still growing stronger with each passing day. In Tallahassee, Florida, Bundy rented a small room near the Florida State University campus. He was using the name Chris Hagen, and to his neighbors, he seemed like just another drifter trying to get by. But beneath that ordinary facade, something was building. The stress of being a fugitive, the isolation, the constant fear of capture, it was all feeding into a psychological pressure cooker that was about to explode. On the night of January 14th, 1978, that pressure finally burst. Bundy had been drinking heavily, and sometime after midnight, he made his way to the Chi Omega sorority house on West Jefferson Street. The back door had a faulty lock, something he'd likely noticed during his reconnaissance of the area. He slipped inside while the young women slept, carrying a piece of oak firewood he'd picked up outside. What happened next was a frenzy of violence that shocked even seasoned investigators. In less than 15 minutes, Bundy turned a peaceful sorority house into a scene of unimaginable horror. He entered the room of 21-year-old Margaret Bowman first, bludgeoning her to death with the piece of wood as she slept. Then he moved to the room of Lisa Levy, where his violence reached new depths of depravity. He beat her unconscious, strangled her, bit deeply into her left buttock, and sexually assaulted her with a hairspray bottle. But Bundy wasn't finished. He attacked two other women, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, both of whom survived but were left with severe injuries. After fleeing the sorority house, he ran to Dunwoody Street, where he broke into the apartment of another FSU student, Cheryl Thomas. He beat her so severely that she was left with permanent disabilities, but somehow she survived. The attacks sent shockwaves through the Florida State University community and beyond. The level of violence was unprecedented, even for someone with Bundy's history. It was as if all the rage and frustration he'd built up during his time as a fugitive had been unleashed in one horrific night. The bite mark on Lisa Levy's body would later become crucial evidence, but at the time, investigators were simply trying to process the brutality of what they'd found. Bundy's final victim was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. On February 9th, 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was walking between buildings at her middle school in Lake City, Florida, when she encountered Bundy. He was driving a stolen white van, and somehow he managed to lure the young girl away from the safety of her school. Witnesses later reported seeing a man matching Bundy's description, leading a young girl toward a white van, but by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. Kimberly's disappearance launched a massive search effort. Her parents, teachers, and hundreds of volunteers combed through the surrounding area, hoping against hope that she might be found alive. But deep down, everyone feared the worst. The connection to the Chi Omega murders hadn't been made yet, but the timing and location suggested that the same predator was responsible. 2 months later, Kimberly's remains were found in Suwannee River State Park, 35 miles from where she'd been abducted. The condition of her body confirmed everyone's worst fears. She had been murdered shortly after her abduction. The loss of such a young, innocent life added another layer of horror to Bundy's already monstrous legacy. By this time, Bundy's luck was finally running out. He'd been spotted in the white van, and investigators were closing in. On February 15th, 1978, just days after Kimberly's disappearance, Bundy was pulled over by Pensacola police officer David Lee. He was driving a stolen orange Volkswagen Beetle, and when Officer Lee ran the plates, he discovered the car had been reported stolen. But it was more than just a routine traffic stop. Lee had been briefed about the Chi Omega murders and was on the lookout for suspicious individuals. When Lee approached the car, Bundy tried to run. There was a brief struggle, but this time there would be no escape. Officer Lee subdued Bundy and placed him under arrest. As he was being handcuffed, Bundy reportedly said, "I wish you had killed me." It was a moment of raw honesty from a man who knew that his reign of terror was finally over. The arrest made national headlines. Ted Bundy, the charming law student who had become America's most wanted fugitive, was finally behind bars. But even as he sat in his jail cell, Bundy continued to play games with investigators. He refused to confess, maintained his innocence, and even tried to represent himself in court. It was all part of his narcissistic need to control the narrative, even when the evidence against him was overwhelming. The forensic evidence was damning. The bite mark on Lisa Levy's body was matched to Bundy's teeth, providing a direct physical link between him and the murder. Eyewitness testimony placed him at the scene of Kimberly Leach's abduction, and fibers from the stolen van were found on her clothing. For the first time in his criminal career, Bundy couldn't talk his way out of the charges. The trials that followed were a media circus. Bundy's decision to represent himself turned the courtroom into a stage for his narcissistic performances. He cross-examined witnesses, delivered opening statements, and even proposed marriage to his longtime girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, during the penalty phase of his trial. The marriage proposal was accepted, and under Florida law, the declaration in front of a judge made them legally married. But all of Bundy's theatrics couldn't change the facts. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through his charm, offensive to the monster beneath. He was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death. In a separate trial, he was also convicted of Kimberly Leach's murder and received another death sentence. As Bundy sat on death row, the full scope of his crimes began to emerge. Investigators from multiple states visited him, hoping to get confessions that would bring closure to families who had lost loved ones. For years, Bundy refused to cooperate, but as his execution date approached, he began to talk. In his final days, he confessed to 30 murders, though investigators believe the actual number was much higher. The confessions were chilling in their detail. Bundy described how he would return to the burial sites of his victims, sometimes months after the murders, to perform necrophilic acts on their decomposing remains. He talked about the thrill of the hunt, the pleasure he derived from having complete control over another human being's life and death. There was no remorse, no genuine regret, just a cold, clinical description of unspeakable acts. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Outside the prison, crowds gathered to celebrate, holding signs that read "Burn Bundy Burn" and "Tuesday is Friday." It was a grim carnival atmosphere, but for many it represented justice finally being served. The families of his victims could finally have some sense of closure, knowing that the man who had caused them so much pain would never hurt anyone again. But even in death, Bundy's legacy continued to haunt American society. His crimes had changed the way people thought about serial killers, about the nature of evil, and about the dangers that could lurk behind a charming smile. He had proven that monsters don't always look like monsters, that evil can wear a mask of normalcy and respectability. The psychological impact of Bundy's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. Parents became more protective of their children, women became more cautious about helping strangers, and society as a whole became more aware of the predators that might be living among us. The innocence of the 1970s was shattered, replaced by a harder, more cynical understanding of human nature. In the decades since his execution, Bundy has become a dark cultural icon, the subject of countless books, documentaries, and movies. His story continues to fascinate and horrify, serving as a reminder of the depths of human depravity and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would do us harm. Ted Bundy's final capture and execution marked the end of one of the most notorious criminal careers in American history. But his story serves as more than just a cautionary tale about a single monster. It's a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, that charm and intelligence can mask the darkest intentions, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would abuse the trust of others. The young women who died at Bundy's hands were more than just statistics in a criminal case. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and students with bright futures ahead of them. Their lives were cut short by a man who saw them not as human beings, but as objects to be possessed and destroyed. In remembering their stories, we honor their memory and remind ourselves of the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting the innocent from those who would do them harm.